More death sentences imposed in Egypt. 75 people for allegedly protesting against the 2013 coup. Will it deter opponents of the government? Will we see another military crackdown? And is reconciliation even possible now? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. There's been strong condemnation from human rights groups at the latest wave of death sentences imposed in Egypt. Most of the 75 convicted were taking part in a sit-in at a public square in Cairo 5 years ago, protesting against a military coup. Hundreds of people died when security forces moved in. The sentences are the latest in unrelenting crackdown on dissent in Egypt since current President Abdel Fattah El Sisi toppled Mohamed Morsi, the country's first democratically elected president. Cairo has more.
5 years after what's been called the largest mass killing in Egypt's modern history, it seems the bloodshed has yet to end. More than 900 protesters were killed by Egyptian security forces in a matter of hours during a sit-in in Cairo's Rabaa al-Adawiya Square in 2013. They were protesting against the military takeover by this man, President Abdel Fattah El Sisi, who deposed Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. As more than 85,000 supporters demonstrated against the coup, security forces moved in. Now, 5 years on, a court in Cairo has sentenced 75 people to death.
Ismail Mohamed Rashwan and Yassin Mohamed Suleiman are sentenced to death.
Those sentenced to death were part of a mass trial of 739 people convicted of charges from incitement to violence, murder, and membership of the now outlawed group, the Muslim Brotherhood. Senior members of the organization were among those given life sentences, including its spiritual leader, Mohamed Badia. The judge handed prison terms to 39 others, as well as the known photojournalist Mahmoud Abu Zaid, also known as Shokan. He'll now be released after serving his 5-year sentence in pre-trial detention, having been arrested while photographing the day that changed many Egyptians' lives.
The sentence is unfair because Shokan didn't commit any crime to be imprisoned for 5 years. He was a journalist only doing his job. The sentence wasn't based on any evidence. It was based only on police investigations, as the court has said. We also have proof of his innocence.
Human rights organizations have condemned the mass trial, calling it a mockery of justice.
What we have yet to see is, according to what Amnesty International calls the greatest massacre of protesters by a government in modern history, of over 1,000 people shot by the Egyptian security apparatus, is not a single person has yet to be held into account. And so in many ways, today just signifies the symbolic farce that has become of the Egyptian judiciary and political establishment.
The court's decision now goes to Egypt's top religious leader, the Grand Mufti. But his judgment is seen as a formality, and he's expected to approve the executions. Lawyers of the convicted say they'll appeal the sentences. For Inside Story, Cairo, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our panel. In Doha, Mohamed Elmasry, Associate Professor of Media and Cultural Studies and Chair of the Journalism Program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. In New York, Sahar Aziz, Professor of Law at the Rutgers University in New Jersey and Director of the Center on Security, Race and Rights. From Zurich, via Skype, Magid Mandour, a political analyst. Welcome to the program. Mohammed, are we going to see any end to these mass trials anytime soon in Egypt?
Well, it's unlikely. The Egyptian government post-2013 has been hell-bent on an eliminationist strategy, right? They're trying to root out all forms of dissent and opposition. Obviously, we know about the mass killings that they carried out in the streets. We know about banning political parties and media outlets. Part of this, though, is intimidating activists. And so there are 60,000 plus political prisoners. We've seen several mass death sentences following mass trials, which are quite absurd. There's no possibility to establish individual guilt in these mass trials. And so this was just one in a long line. It's unfortunate, and it's probably unlikely that this sort of repression stops anytime soon.
Sahar, if this is a campaign of intimidation, as Mohamed has been just saying, I mean, every single mass trial has been described by international human rights groups as a charade, grotesque parody of justice. Yet the government insists this is quite legitimate. What kind of message do you think the government is trying to convey here?
I think it shows that the Sisi regime feels very insecure internally. They seem to be approaching it as an existential threat to their political power by taking the scorched earth approach to mass prosecutions, mass death sentences, and, as you said, engaging in activities that undermines the rule of law in Egypt and effectively defames Egypt's reputation internationally. Part of the reason that he can get away with it is because President Trump of the United States has signaled to him that he can, and that he will not be punishing Egypt, at least in terms of holding any foreign aid or criticizing it in the public arena, in the international public arena. So Sisi feels quite emboldened. And in fact, in July, the U.S. just approved another $195 million of foreign aid to Egypt, notwithstanding that there is the Leahy Act that prohibits the U.S. from providing foreign aid to countries that violate human rights. So we, as a country, in the United States, where I'm based, we've essentially given him the green light. And I think the American citizens need to be very concerned about where their taxpayer money is going, because right now it's supporting human rights violations in Egypt.
Magid, what are people in Egypt saying about these trials?
Well, it's very hard to gauge and very hard to know because, as you would know, this is all very censored and very controlled. So even though the Brotherhood has lost a lot of popular support, it remains an integral a part of the Egyptian, let's say, society. So I'm pretty sure that it's not widely accepted that it's fair. However, there is also a lot of support for the regime. So it's not as clear cut as it might look.
Mohamed, you said that basically you expect this crackdown to continue. However, one of the cases, Mahmoud Abu Zaid, known as Shawkan, spent 5 years in jail. He won the UNESCO's World Freedom Prize. I mean, you can see on one hand the government is determined, but at the same time there's an international backlash, at least when it comes to the coverage of the cases of the activists who have been detained by the Egyptian government.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, the backlash has waned a little bit over the past couple of years. And just to Sahar's point, I think she made a good point when she said that the Egyptian government pretty much feels emboldened. And why wouldn't they feel emboldened? There has been very little consequence. There have been very few repercussions for them. They've committed more human rights violations than any government in the history of modern Egypt. And yet international diplomacy, military aid, weapons sales, they've all proceeded as business as usual. In terms of Shawkan, Mahmoud Abu Zaid, I think that it's interesting to note, as my colleague Professor Dalia Fahmy noted yesterday, that after 5 years keeping him in jail, charging him with felony offenses, including murder, that they're going to let him go, and that's an indication that they never had any evidence on him to begin with. So here's a young man who's essentially lost 5 years of his life.
Sahar, in technical terms, can some of these cases be overturned, or do you think that they would ultimately be upheld by the Grand Mufti and by the Supreme Courts?
Well, a lot of it depends on to what extent the judiciary is independent. And in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen an erosion of judicial independence, primarily through unspoken, behind-the-scenes fear tactics against judges. So the Egyptian executive has successfully placed certain judges that are known to be loyalists in these cases so that they could predict the outcome, which would be convictions, and at the same time has signaled to those judges who have not been as obedient to the executive as the president would like, they have forced them into retirement, they have subjected them to false pretextual disciplinary hearings, and they have punished them in other ways. So much of it is going to depend on the judges. Some of these cases do get reversed, and some of the death sentences are not approved by the Mufti, who also faces pressure by the state. But unfortunately, I think most of the pressure has to come from the international human rights communities. We can no longer rely on the U.S. government. We certainly can't rely on the Egyptian government. And I think it's time for those who care about human rights abroad to be advocating very aggressively for support of those rights and not allowing Western taxpayer dollars to support these dictatorial regimes that effectively produce more instability in that region. And I predict there will probably be another mass uprising, although this time it will be based on economic hardship because Egypt is suffering from very severe economic problems right now.
Magid, what would the government gain internationally from the scenes of some of the old leaders hit by the death penalty? Some of them are in their 80s, who were part of an official political party that won the elections, and they had one of their members elected as the first democratically elected president in Egypt. I mean, it begs the question, what is government trying to do here?
Well, I think the government is trying to send a very clear signal, is that there will be no reconciliation. There will be no integration of the Brotherhood in any way, shape, or form into the political process. And that means that one of the largest political parties in the country will not, let's say, participate legally. If they will carry out the death sentences, that remains to be seen. But also the strategy can be to prolong it, and they would remain in jail for a long period until they pass away, because the conditions as well in jails are let's say horrendous. So that can be a strategy that they're following as well.
Mohammed, there's been this feeling after the last elections that El Sisi would go for a softer approach, trying to reach out to the opposition and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. With this particular mass trial, that does not seem to be the case anymore.
No, I think that I agree with Magid that the message that's being sent here is that reconciliation is not on the table. It's not an option. The government has tried very hard to bury the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So and certainly they've succeeded in that, at least publicly. They've arrested or killed the first several tiers of Brotherhood leadership. They've banned their media, they've banned their political party, and they've carried out these mass arrests, mass death sentences on Brotherhood members and supporters. Obviously, they broke up protests, and so they shut down NGOs, which I don't think we should forget. They shut down websites, they shut down charitable organizations. So the Brotherhood is essentially buried, at least from public view. The Brotherhood is still popular in Egypt. We don't know exactly how popular because the Egyptian government doesn't allow opinion polling any longer. But I think that certainly from a political standpoint, from a social standpoint, the government wants the Brotherhood to sort of go away. They don't want to deal with the Brotherhood as a political rival any longer. And certainly at this point, there doesn't look like there's any space for the Brotherhood to operate.
Sahar, the man who used to deliver stinging remarks and rebukes about Egypt's track record when it comes to human rights, was the late Senator McCain. Are we likely to see anyone who would step in the near future under the Trump administration to try to change the course of things?
I don't think there's any hope for expecting anything from the White House. Because frankly, I think at the domestic level, Trump himself is an authoritarian. And the only thing that's keeping him from being as severe as other authoritarians are the institutions within the United States and the press and civil society, which is precisely why Sisi has gone after and tried to destroy the free press and civil society in Egypt. And by the way, it's not only the Muslim Brotherhood that he has effectively quashed, but it's also the self-identified liberals of Egypt, who now have no political space to have meaningful political parties. In fact, during Ramadan, an iftar dinner was attacked by the police that was hosted by a bunch of liberal parties. So the plan in Egypt is we don't want any competition, any type of political activity whatsoever. Going back to the U.S., I think unfortunately in Congress right now, most congressional leaders are either focused on the domestic arena in trying to switch the Congress to be more democratic, controlled by the Democratic Party, and very few of them are globally focused. So I don't expect much pressure from the U.S. government. But I do want to note one thing. We have 20 American citizens in Egyptian jails right now. And what is our government doing to protect them and to ensure that they're getting fair due process trials? Mustafa Qasim is one of them, who was a New York City taxi driver and was at the wrong place at the wrong time during the Rabaa massacres. We have Ola Al-Qaradawi, who is the daughter of the Sheikh Al-Qaradawi. Now, she's a U.S. Green card holder. She's not a citizen, but she has children that are U.S. citizens, and she lived much of her life in the U.S. She's in jail for retaliation against her father. And we have, again, 20 American citizens. And I cannot believe that the Trump administration does not care about its own citizens. And what signal does this send about the value of U.S. citizenship abroad in front of these dictators?
Magid, speaking of the muted international response, could it be an indication that leaders across the board are trying to tell the Muslim Brotherhood and the activists in Egypt, you have to leave that chapter behind and move forward, and that ultimately you have to face reality, which is basically that the military establishment and Abdel Fattah El Sisi are the ones who call the final shots?
Well, there is no reality to look forward to. There is no space for any democratic participation. Sisi is basically trying to convert the country into a full-blown military dictatorship. There is no reconciliation in any way, shape, or form. And he doesn't seem to allow to leave some space, at least for some sort of controlled dissent. There is no room for any disagreements. So I don't know what they would be saying to any political activists at the moment.
Okay.
It's a ridiculous notion.
Mohammed, the establishment is quite interesting. Now, when you look at the latest developments in Egypt, the establishment does not seem to tolerate opposition that does not necessarily, which is not necessarily confined to the Islamist or to the Muslim Brotherhood. We've seen the case of Sami Anan, who was sent to jail just because he was seen as a potential rival. Masoum Marzouk, Yahya Al-Gazzaz, Hisham Genina, all sent to jail because they expressed their views. What does it tell about Sisi's situation in Egypt?
Yeah, well, I think as somebody mentioned previously, he's obviously insecure. I mean, I think that's one of the messages here, or one of the lessons that we can learn. But I think the other thing, I think the bigger issue is that the Egyptian military establishment and the security forces in general learned a very valuable lesson during the Arab Spring, and in particular in Egypt in 2011, when Hosni Mubarak, the 30-year dictator, was ousted. The lesson that they learned, unfortunately, for Egyptian citizens is that the government hadn't been harsh enough. And so they're really trying to sort of be more repressive, more authoritarian than the Mubarak government ever was. And that's why we see all of these unprecedented human rights abuses.
Sahar, this is what baffles me. I mean, the government wants to build a new capital in the desert, encourages investors to come in and tourists to pick up tourism to pick up again in his country. But how can you achieve that when your track record is contested, challenged by the international community?
And I think that is effectively his weak spot, both domestically and internationally. So internationally, Egypt needs to have a good reputation, particularly to attract tourists. The last thing it needs is to be seen as an unsafe place or a place that is repressive in a way that could cause already sensitive tourists not to want to go there. And that's where I think Sisi should be reconsidering his practices domestically. Domestically, his weakness is economic. The inflation rate is officially at 13%. I think more effectively it's in the 20s and 30s. Unemployment's at 11% officially. When you look at people under the age of 35, it goes up to the 20 percentile. You have many college students or college graduates who are now driving Uber because that is the only way to make money. They have no employment prospects. And inflation is up, wages are stagnant. He's now starting to increase taxes through value-added taxes, through income taxes. And the Egyptian people are starting to become very resentful. And that is one area where you are hearing open dissent against him. So if the Egyptian government wants to be smart about its governance, at the very least, it needs to ensure that it develops its economy. And violating human rights does not assist it in that objective.
Magid, we've seen over the last few months President Abdel Fattah El Sisi firing some of his closest aides, implementing new restrictions on media, particularly the new law about social media accounts and the fact that if you have more than 5,000 followers on Twitter, for example, then you would be monitored by a particular body in Egypt. Some of the staunch journalists who are defending El Sisi have recently been banned. Are we talking here about a new transformation in Egypt, or what is it in particular?
Well, it's very hard to tell because the regime is quite, let's say, opaque. But however, it is very clear that he is taking more of a hard line, and that he is becoming more and more repressive, especially after the elections. So it seems to be the general direction and the general policy where even insider dissent within the regime itself is no longer tolerated.
Okay. Mohamed, I mean, don't you think that this also begs another question about being realistic in Egypt, particularly when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood? They don't seem to have supporters anymore all over the world. They're facing a harsh new reality. They've been completely undermined. Their top leadership is in jail, and we haven't seen their own people on the streets for quite some time. Is this the moment for the MB to start reinventing itself?
I don't know how successful they would be, doing that right now. As I mentioned earlier, they've been pretty much completely buried. They've lost members either through death or imprisonment. Some people have left the organization. I think that it's, ideally this would be a time for the Muslim Brotherhood to do some soul searching and to try to reinvent itself. But how does one reinvent himself or herself in such a closed and repressive environment? They are officially banned. Muslim Brotherhood supporters or people who are known to have been Brotherhood members are not even allowed to run for office in Egypt as independent candidates. So how can you reinvent yourself in that context?
In less than 30 seconds, Sahar, can international human rights organizations now step in and try to change things in Egypt, or at least change the perception that we're seeing internationally about what's happening?
Absolutely. I think international human rights organizations have access to the media. They can mobilize citizens in the West where there is more democratic processes. They can give a platform to Egyptians and other Arabs who seek reform within their countries and give them a voice. And human rights has always been the underdog. And the only way that you fight for justice is to take risks. So I think this is exactly the time when the international human rights community needs to step up and challenge these dictators.
Sahar, Aziz, Mohamed Elmasry, Magid Mando, it's always good to talk to you. Looking forward to seeing you in the near future. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.